The catastrophic collapse of World Championship Wrestling was not caused by a lack of money, but by a toxic backstage culture that actively destroyed its own future. Nothing exposes this institutional rot more perfectly than the bitter, behind-the-scenes war between a suppressed prodigy named Chris Jericho and the company's heavily protected corporate creation, Bill Goldberg. When Jericho used his sheer brilliance to organically build the most highly anticipated rivalry in the industry, insecure executives conspired to kill the storyline just to protect Goldberg's fragile ego. They attempted to publicly execute Jericho's career with a humiliating 30-second squash match, proving they would rather crush a rising star than share the main event spotlight. This single arrogant political decision didn't just drive Jericho into the arms of their greatest rival, it perfectly exposed the terminal rot of a billion-dollar empire that was actively choking to death on its own vanity. The psychological trauma Jericho endured over the next 3 years was no accident. It was a direct byproduct of WCW's toxic corporate architecture. The company was bankrolled by media mogul Ted Turner, a man with a bottomless checkbook who wanted to defeat his rival Vince McMahon at any cost. To achieve this, WCW management, led by Eric Bischoff, did not build stars from the ground up. Instead, they purchased established, aging superstars from the 1980s. Men like Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall. To entice these veterans to jump ship, WCW offered them something far more dangerous than just guaranteed multi-million-dollar contracts. They offered them a contractual clause known as creative control. In the history of the entertainment business, granting a performer absolute creative control over their own television storylines is a recipe for systemic paralysis. It legally permitted these aging veterans to dictate who they worked with, how their matches ended, and how much television time they occupied. Human nature, particularly within a deeply insecure industry built on ego and public perception, dictates self-preservation. These men, comfortably in their 40s, were not incentivized to build new stars. They were incentivized to protect their spots at the absolute top of the hierarchy. They formed an impenetrable ceiling. They monopolized the main event scene, monopolized the microphone time, and structurally ensured that no young performer could ever generate enough momentum to challenge their supremacy. Jericho was slotted into the newly created cruiserweight division. On paper, and to the millions of fans watching at home, this division was the most exciting part of the 3-hour Monday Nitro broadcast. It featured smaller, faster, incredibly gifted athletes performing dangerous, breathtaking maneuvers. But behind the curtain, the cruiserweight division was a gilded cage. It was a corporate containment zone. The executives and the main event veterans viewed the cruiserweights with a mixture of condescension and quiet anxiety. Jericho and his peers were sent out in the first hour of the television broadcast. Their unspoken corporate mandate was brutal and clear. Go out to the ring, risk your neck to wake the crowd up, provide high-octane filler, and then immediately disappear into the background so the aging heavyweights could slowly walk to the ring in the third hour and claim the glory. For an intensely ambitious performer like Jericho, this realization was a slow, agonizing poison. Professional wrestling is a uniquely psychological art form. The performer relies entirely on the emotional investment of the crowd. When you go to the ring night after night, executing flawless matches, putting your physical health on the line, and the crowd responds with deafening roars, you expect a promotion? You expect the invisible hand of management to tap you on the shoulder and move you up the card? Instead, Jericho found himself trapped in a loop of deliberate stagnation. He would steal the show, only to be told the next week that he was not booked for television. He would pitch ideas to the writers suggesting storylines that would develop his character beyond just being a smiling guy who did athletic flips. And those ideas would be routinely ignored or actively vetoed by the veterans who held the pen. The cruelty of this system was its quiet, bureaucratic efficiency. Management did not need to shout at Jericho. They did not need to fire him. They simply starved him of narrative oxygen. They placed an invisible ceiling inches above his head and watched him repeatedly batter his skull against it. The psychological toll of being highly competent in a corrupt system cannot be overstated. If Jericho had lacked talent, his position at the bottom of the card would have been understandable, perhaps even acceptable to him. The profound frustration stemmed from the fact that he knew he was better. The fans knew he was better. And crucially, the veteran sitting in the back knew he was better. His talent was not a deficiency. It was the exact reason he was being suppressed. If a 20-something cruiserweight proved he could talk better, wrestle better, and draw a louder reaction than the million-dollar headliners, it exposed the fundamental financial inefficiencies of the WCW business model. Jericho's sheer competence made the aging giants look slow, archaic, and overpaid. Therefore, Jericho had to be kept down. By the summer of 1997, the toll of playing by the rules began to manifest publicly. Jericho was portraying a traditional clean-cut hero known as the Lionheart. He smiled, he slapped hands with the fans, and he wrestled honorably. But modern television audiences are incredibly perceptive. They can smell a lack of corporate backing. The fans realized that no matter how hard Jericho fought, management was never going to allow him to win the matches that truly mattered. Consequently, the audience began to view his smiling, persistent optimism not as heroic, but as pathetic. They began to turn on him. They started booing the Lionheart. For a performer, being rejected by the audience when you are desperately trying to please them is a terrifying experience. It is the moment a career can permanently flatline. Many wrestlers in Jericho's position would have broken under the pressure. They would have accepted their fate, collected their weekly paycheck, and allowed the corporate machine to quietly digest them into obscurity. But Chris Jericho did not possess the psychology of a compliant employee. He possessed the ego and the intellect of a survivor. As the boos grew louder in late 1997, Jericho sat in the grim concrete locker rooms of WCW and assessed his reality. The traditional path to the main event was blocked by a wall of millionaires. His athletic prowess was being exploited as cheap opening act fodder. His scripted character was dying a public death. If he continued to wait for the executives to hand him an opportunity, he would be waiting until his career evaporated. He realized a fundamental truth about navigating a corrupt, politically entrenched monopoly. If the system refuses to write you a storyline, you must write your own. If the entrenched old guard refuses to give you a microphone, you must steal one. He understood that he could not beat the backstage politicians by being a better athlete. He had to become a better politician. He had to stop trying to please the management that hated him and start weaponizing their disdain to his own advantage. The Lionheart was dead. The era of playing by the rules was over. The rebellion was about to begin, and it would start with a single highly calculated smirk. The transformation of Chris Jericho did not begin with a dramatic corporate meeting or a sudden change in his television script. It began with a quiet internal resignation. He realized that playing the role of the smiling, rule-abiding athlete was a guaranteed ticket to professional obscurity. In the hyper-masculine, politically treacherous environment of World Championship Wrestling, obedience was not rewarded. It was exploited. If the corporate machine was determined to cast him as a secondary player, he would have to hijack the narrative. He would have to become a villain. But Jericho did not want to be a standard cookie-cutter villain. In the professional wrestling industry, the traditional heel is a character who cheats to win, insults the local sports team, and cowers away from a fair fight. That archetype was tired, and more importantly, it was heavily controlled by the writers. Jericho needed something far more subversive. He needed a character that allowed him to air his genuine, deeply held grievances against the WCW executives, while disguising it as entertainment. He created the persona of the conspiracy victim. On live television, Jericho began to grab the microphone and declare with absolute hysterical conviction that there was a coordinated plot by WCW management, the referees, and the broadcasters to keep him at the bottom of the roster. He claimed that the schedule was rigged against him, that his opponents were receiving preferential treatment, and that the executives were deliberately holding down the greatest talent in the company. The brilliance of this character lay in its dangerous proximity to the truth. Professional wrestling operates on a concept called kayfabe, the illusion that the scripted events are real. For decades, the industry relied on keeping the audience completely in the dark about backstage politics. But by 1998, the advent of the early internet had begun to pull back the curtain. A growing segment of the audience understood that wrestling was scripted, and they were acutely aware of the political stranglehold that the aging veterans had on WCW. When Jericho stood in the ring and ranted about a conspiracy, the executives sitting in the back thought he was just performing a funny, delusional character. But the audience in the arena knew exactly what he was doing. They recognized that he was breaking the fourth wall. He was weaponizing the microphone to publicly broadcast his genuine frustration with the company's glass ceiling. He was speaking a coded language to the fans, and the fans responded with explosive enthusiasm. This is where the true, undeniable genius of Chris Jericho emerged. The WCW management controlled the match outcomes. They could dictate that Jericho had to lose a bout in 6 minutes. They could dictate his opponent. But live television contains inherent loopholes, and the microphone was Jericho's loophole. Once he walked through the curtain and the red light on the camera illuminated, the executives in the back lost their absolute control. For the 2 or 3 minutes he had the microphone, Jericho was the sole author of his own destiny. He began to meticulously craft his dialogue, ensuring every second of his allotted television time was unforgettable. He intentionally mispronounced the names of his opponents, stripping them of their dignity. He threw childish temper tantrums when he lost, destroying ringside equipment in a way that mocked the overly serious macho posturing of the veteran heavyweights. He even hired his own security detail. At the time, WCW's main event star Bill Goldberg was famously escorted to the ring by a phalanx of intense, heavily armed police officers. It was a visual designed to make Goldberg look like the most important athlete on earth. Jericho, operating on a fraction of Goldberg's budget and with zero corporate support, parodied this perfectly. He found a heavily overweight, balding truck driver who worked for the arena crew, dressed him in a tight, unflattering t-shirt with the word security written on it in marker pen, and named him Ralphus. When Jericho walked to the ring, flanked by the bewildered, shambling Ralphus, the contrast was a masterpiece of physical comedy. But beneath the comedy was a razor-sharp satire of WCW's bloated main event egos. Jericho was telling the audience, "Look how ridiculous this entire corporate machine is. Look how easily I can make a mockery of their multi-million-dollar production." The absolute zenith of this subversive campaign occurred in early 1998 during a feud with a highly respected, technically brilliant wrestler named Dean Malenko. Malenko was a quiet, stoic performer whose gimmick was built entirely around his flawless in-ring execution. He was billed as the Man of 1,000 Holds, a moniker meant to convey his vast encyclopedic knowledge of submission wrestling. WCW management booked Jericho into a program with Malenko, expecting Jericho to simply play his part, lose the matches, and make the veteran look dominant. Jericho saw an opportunity to hijack the broadcast. He decided that if Malenko knew 1,000 holds, the conspiracy victim must naturally know more. He claimed to be the man of 1,004 holds. To execute the joke, Jericho procured a massive stack of continuous perforated computer paper from the WCW production office. He walked down to the ring on a live, globally broadcast episode of WCW Monday Nitro. Carrying this towering, absurdly long manuscript, he grabbed the microphone, demanded total silence from the roaring crowd, and announced that he was going to read every single one of his holds to prove his superiority. He began to read, "Hold number 1, arm bar. Hold number 2, the moss-covered three-handled family gradunza. Hold number 3, arm bar. Hold number 4, the Saskatchewan spinning nerve hold." The timing was impeccable. Just as the audience was beginning to realize the sheer mind-numbing length of the list, the television broadcast cut to a commercial break. In the standard operating procedure of live television, when the show goes to commercial, the performers in the arena stop talking and wait for the broadcast to return. Jericho did not stop. For the entirety of the 3-minute commercial break, he stood in the center of the ring, furiously reading his list to the live arena audience. When the broadcast returned to live television, millions of homes across America, the camera panned back to the ring. Jericho was still standing there, the computer paper now spilling out over the ropes and onto the arena floor. "Hold number 712, arm bar," he shouted into the microphone. The arena erupted. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated television magic. Jericho had taken a throwaway segment designed to make someone else look good and turned it into one of the most memorable moments in the history of the company. He had proven that he did not need the main event spot. He did not need pyrotechnics. and he did not need the backing of the corporate writers to captivate an audience. He just needed a microphone and a few sheets of computer paper. Following the 1004 holds incident, the television ratings for Jericho's segments began to climb rapidly. The fans were tuning in specifically to see what the arrogant, hilarious cruiserweight was going to do next. In any rational, profit-driven entertainment enterprise, management would look at these metrics, identify the organic growth, and immediately begin heavily promoting the performer. They would see a rising star who was connecting with the demographic, and they would strap a rocket to his back. But as we have established, WCW was not a rational enterprise. It was a political minefield ruled by insecurity. Instead of being rewarded for his initiative, Jericho found the corporate walls closing in tighter. Eric Bischoff, the executive in charge of WCW, viewed Jericho's rising popularity with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Bischoff was a man who had built his reputation by purchasing ready-made stars. He did not know how to cultivate a grassroots phenomenon, nor did he particularly want to. To the corporate mindset, an employee who succeeds without explicit permission is not an asset. They are a rogue element. Furthermore, the legacy headliners who held the creative control clauses were watching the monitors in the back. They saw the crowd reactions Jericho was generating. They saw that a 20-something kid in the opening match was getting louder cheers for reading a piece of paper than they were getting for their carefully choreographed, heavily produced main events. In a healthy locker room, this would inspire competition. In the WCW locker room, it inspired a quiet, venomous resentment. The veterans began to whisper in the ears of management. They dismissed Jericho as a comedy act. They argued that his smaller stature made him unbelievable as a true heavyweight contender. They insisted that his subversive promos were disrespectful to the traditions of the business. This is the psychological torture of being an ambitious prodigy in a decaying empire. Jericho was doing the impossible. He was succeeding despite the system actively working against him. Yet every time he proved his worth, the goalposts were moved. He was told he was too small. He was told he was too funny to be taken seriously. He was told he lacked the it factor required to share the ring with the millionaires. He was trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare where his own competence was being used as the justification for his suppression. Management effectively communicated a deeply cynical message. You are very entertaining, Chris, but you are entertaining in the wrong way. You are not one of us, and therefore, you will never be allowed to cross the invisible line. By late 1998, Jericho had exhausted every creative avenue available to him in the lower ranks of the card. He had outgrown the cruiserweight division. He had outgrown the mid-card championships. The audience was demanding his elevation, and Jericho knew that he possessed the talent to carry the company into the next decade. He realized that quiet rebellion was no longer enough. The satire and the comedy had protected his sanity and built his fan base, but they had not shattered the glass ceiling. If he wanted to force the hands of the executives, he could no longer stay in his lane and mock them from a distance. He had to cross the invisible line. He had to pick a fight with the most protected, most lucrative, and most politically sensitive asset in the entire WCW empire. He had to call out Bill Goldberg, And in doing so, Chris Jericho was about to initiate a backstage war that would ultimately force him to choose between a guaranteed fortune and his own professional soul. To fully comprehend the sheer audacity of Chris Jericho's decision to target Bill Goldberg in late 1998, one must first understand what Goldberg represented within the corporate ecosystem of World Championship Wrestling. He was not merely a professional wrestler. He was a highly manufactured, heavily protected, million-dollar corporate asset. Bill Goldberg was a former American football player whose gridiron career had been cut short by injury. He possessed an incredibly intense, intimidating physical presence, a hulking figure with a shaved head, intense eyes, and a terrifying, explosive power. When WCW management discovered him, they realized they had stumbled upon a visual gold mine. However, Goldberg lacked the fundamental experience, the years of global training, and the nuanced psychology that performers like Jericho had spent their entire youth cultivating. To hide these glaring professional deficiencies, WCW management designed a brilliant, albeit restrictive, booking strategy. They created the illusion of an unstoppable monster. They marched Goldberg to the ring, surrounded him with security guards and blinding pyrotechnics, and had him absolutely obliterate his opponents in less than 2 minutes. He did not talk. He did not engage in long, complex matches that might expose his lack of technical skill. He simply speared his opponents, pinned them, and left. This strategy worked with terrifying efficiency. The audience bought into the illusion completely. Goldberg embarked on a heavily promoted, corporate-sponsored, undefeated streak. By the autumn of 1998, he was the world heavyweight champion and arguably the single most popular, lucrative commodity in the entire professional wrestling industry. He was the undisputed king of the WCW empire. For a mid-level cruiserweight like Chris Jericho to unilaterally initiate a feud with the world heavyweight champion was not just ambitious. In the hyper-political environment of WCW, it was practically an act of corporate treason. Jericho understood the unwritten rules of the locker room. He knew that wrestlers of his size and status were entirely forbidden from interacting with the franchise players unless explicitly ordered to do so by the executive committee. But Jericho also understood the fundamental economics of the entertainment business far better than the executives managing him. He looked at Goldberg and saw a massive, silent monster who desperately needed a loud, obnoxious antagonist to talk people into buying pay-per-view tickets. It was the classic timeless narrative of David and Goliath, but in this iteration, David was a cowardly, charismatic nuisance who refused to shut up, and Goliath was an irritable giant who wanted to tear David's head off. Operating entirely without the official sanction of the creative writing team, Jericho began a guerrilla television campaign. Knowing that Goldberg's intense, untouchable persona was sacred to management, Jericho deliberately dismantled it with biting satire, repeatedly referring to the world champion on international television as Greenberg to strip away his intimidating aura. He created highly entertaining pre-recorded comedic vignettes. In one memorable broadcast, Jericho claimed he was going to march into the WCW training facility in Washington to confront Goldberg face to face. The resulting footage showed Jericho wandering helplessly through the woods, entirely lost, knocking on the doors of random, industrial buildings and acting like a petulant child, while supposedly hunting for the most dangerous man on the planet. In another masterstroke of live television manipulation, Jericho announced to a sold-out arena that he had successfully secured a match with the undefeated champion. The crowd roared in anticipation. The heavy dramatic music of Goldberg began to play. The pyrotechnics fired. The audience rose to their feet. But instead of the towering, muscular world champion emerging from the smoke, a severely undersized, confused-looking local extra stumbled onto the stage, wearing a bald cap and a crude replica of Goldberg's wrestling gear. Jericho brutally beat this imposter in the center of the ring, celebrating as if he had just conquered the greatest athlete in the world. The live crowds devoured it. The television ratings for these segments surged. The audience was deeply invested in the narrative, desperate to see the moment the real, terrifying Goldberg finally got his hands on the arrogant, elusive Jericho. From a purely capitalistic perspective, Jericho had successfully manufactured a highly lucrative scenario out of thin air. He had organically built a program that fans were willing to pay premium prices to see. Jericho's proposition to management was entirely grounded in solid business logic. He envisioned a match at a major Sunday night pay-per-view event. He was completely willing to lose. He had no illusions about defeating the protected champion. His plan was simple. Let him build the tension on free television for weeks, convince the audience to purchase the pay-per-view, and then, on the major stage, allow Goldberg to catch him and destroy him. Goldberg would look like a conquering hero. The company would generate millions in revenue, and Jericho would permanently elevate his own status simply by proving he belonged in the main event picture. It was a scenario where absolutely everyone stood to profit. However, a rational business outcome requires rational executives, and WCW was suffocating under the weight of fragile egos. The aging veterans who controlled the backstage environment, the very men who possessed the creative control clauses, watched Jericho's rising momentum with intense paranoid scrutiny. They recognized that Jericho was managing to get over with the audience without their permission and without playing their political games. To them, Jericho's comedic brilliance was not an asset. It was a profound sign of disrespect to the traditions of the industry they controlled. They began to actively poison the well. These veterans cornered Goldberg in the locker room. They preyed upon his insecurity as a newcomer to the industry. They whispered in his ear, telling him that Jericho was not trying to build a lucrative match, but was instead mocking him on national television to damage his aura. They convinced the world champion that engaging in a storyline with a lowly cruiserweight would devalue his brand. They insisted that a massive, serious athlete like Goldberg should not be seen interacting with a comedic performer like Jericho. Goldberg, lacking the industry experience to recognize that he was being politically manipulated, believed them. He became genuinely furious. He complained to the executive committee led by Eric Bischoff, refusing to work a competitive long-term storyline with Jericho. This is the exact moment where the underlying cruelty of the WCW corporate structure transitioned from passive suppression to active targeted sabotage. Eric Bischoff and the executive committee faced a choice. They could act like true promoters, sit both men in a room, explain the immense financial potential of the match, and order them to execute the pay-per-view program for the benefit of the company's bottom line. Or they could placate the egos of the millionaire veterans, protect the fragile vanity of their champion, and deliberately crush the rising momentum of their most creative young employee. They chose the latter. The mandate was handed down to Jericho in the concrete hallways of a television taping, and it was delivered not as a creative discussion, but as a corporate death sentence. Management informed Jericho that he would indeed get his match with Bill Goldberg. However, it would not take place on a lucrative Sunday night pay-per-view where the company could monetize the tension he had built. It would take place on a random episode of their free weekly television show, WCW Monday Nitro. Furthermore, there would be no competitive match. Jericho was ordered to walk to the ring and be squashed. Goldberg was to spear him, pin him, and leave the ring in a matter of seconds. To the casual observer, a scripted loss in a scripted entertainment industry might not seem like a tragedy. But to fully grasp the severity of this mandate, one must understand the psychology and the economy of professional wrestling. In this industry, your character's credibility is your only currency. If you lose a hard-fought, competitive match on a major stage, you retain your dignity. The audience respects your effort, and your market value remains intact. But a squash match is entirely different. A squash is a deliberate visual communication from the corporation to the audience. It tells the fans, this person is worthless. You were stupid to invest your emotional energy into this character. He is not a threat, he is not a star, and he does not matter. By ordering Jericho to be squashed in seconds on free television, the WCW executives were not just ending a storyline. They were executing a public assassination of his professional credibility. They were sending a vicious, undeniable message to Jericho and to every other young talent in the locker room. It does not matter how hard you work. It does not matter how much the fans love you. It does not matter how much money you can generate. If you step out of your designated place, we will humiliate you, and we will remind you that you are nothing. When Chris Jericho received this order, he experienced a profound, chilling moment of absolute clarity. The frustration and the quiet resentment that had been building inside him for 3 years suddenly crystallized into cold, pragmatic survival instinct. He realized that complying with this order would be the end of his viability as a top-tier performer. If he allowed the corporate machine to squash him on free television, the audience would forever view him as a joke. He would be permanently cemented to the bottom of the roster, forced to live out the rest of his career as a highly athletic punching bag for the wealthy veterans. In a terrifying display of professional defiance, Chris Jericho refused to follow the script. He did not shout. He did not threaten to quit. He engaged in a high-stakes game of corporate brinkmanship. On the night the squash match was scheduled to take place, Jericho literally made himself scarce. He avoided the executive producers. He politely but firmly informed the road agents that he would not participate in a 1-minute physical execution of his character. He argued correctly that throwing away months of television build-up for a free 10-second segment was catastrophic business practice. The backstage environment became incredibly tense. Bill Goldberg was furious. The executives were apoplectic that a mid-card performer was refusing a direct creative order. The aging veterans watched from the shadows, eager to see the rebellious cruiserweight finally fired for insubordination. Jericho was fully aware that his refusal was grounds for immediate termination. He was risking his highly paid contract, his livelihood, and his place in the largest wrestling company on earth. But he possessed a psychological armor that the executives did not understand. He was fundamentally unafraid of losing his job if keeping his job meant losing his dignity. He knew his own worth. He knew he possessed the talent to succeed anywhere in the world, and he refused to allow an insecure corporate monopoly to permanently brand him as a failure. Eventually, a frantic, face-saving compromise was reached just minutes before the television segment went live. The physical squash match was canceled. Instead, a chaotic segment was hastily written where Goldberg marched to the ring, destroyed Jericho's oversized bodyguard, Ralphus, while Jericho managed to flee through the crowd, escaping the champion's wrath. Jericho had successfully avoided the physical execution of his character. He had survived the night, but as the adrenaline faded and he sat alone in the echoing cinderblock locker room after the show, the victory felt entirely hollow. He had won the battle, but the war had provided him with a devastating epiphany. The Goldberg incident laid bare the inescapable systemic rot at the very core of World Championship Wrestling. Jericho looked around and saw a company that was willing to actively sabotage its own financial potential just to protect the fragile egos of its highest-paid employees. He saw an executive committee that operated not on logic or merit, but on fear and political appeasement. He realized that the glass ceiling was not made of glass. It was made of reinforced concrete, poured and maintained by men who would rather see the company burn to the ground than share the spotlight with a younger, smarter generation. There was no future for him here. No amount of hard work, no amount of comedic brilliance, and no amount of crowd reaction would ever change the fundamental architecture of the oligarchy. The trauma of the WCW years was not merely the frustration of being held back. It was the psychological agony of being trapped in a system that punished excellence. As the calendar turned toward 1999, the corporate executives, completely oblivious to the psychological breaking point they had just pushed their most talented performer past, began preparing to negotiate a new contract with Chris Jericho. They believed they still held absolute power. They were about to learn in the most spectacular fashion possible that when you systematically strip a prodigy of his creative freedom, the only thing you leave him with is the burning desire to tear your empire apart. By the spring of 1999, as Chris Jericho's contract expired, the WCW Executive Committee operated on a cynical assumption. Everyone has a price. They slid a highly lucrative contract extension across the table, fully expecting the rebellious cruiserweight to look at the zeros, swallow his pride, and obediently sign his life away. But they profoundly miscalculated the psychology of an elite artist. Jericho stared at the contract and recognized exactly what it represented. It wasn't a promotion, it was a bribe, it was a pair of golden handcuffs. The unspoken terms were crystal clear. Take this money, shut your mouth, and spend the rest of your physical prime acting as a stepping stone for the old boys club. For a performer driven by a relentless obsession to reach the absolute top, signing that document was a creative death warrant. He decided to do the one thing WCW executives believed was impossible. He walked away from the guaranteed millions. He found his escape route in Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation. Unlike the oligarchy of WCW, the WWF in 1999 was a ruthless, fiercely capitalistic meritocracy. In a clandestine meeting in Connecticut, McMahon didn't speak down to Jericho like an insubordinate opening act. McMahon, a notoriously shrewd judge of ambition, saw exactly what WCW had deliberately ignored: a starving main event superstar. He didn't promise Jericho the world championship or easy money. Instead, he offered something far more valuable to a suppressed artist: a fighting chance and a blank canvas. When Jericho officially declined the WCW contract, the executives in Atlanta were paralyzed by arrogant shock. They frantically tried to throw more money at him, but the bridge was already ashes. After 3 years of gaslighting and corporate suppression, Jericho quietly packed his bags and walked out. By allowing him to leave, WCW wasn't just losing a talented performer, they were actively handing their bitter rival the very weapon that would help destroy them. As the summer heated up, Jericho sat down with the WWF creative team to orchestrate a debut designed to send a shockwave through the entire industry. A mysterious countdown clock began appearing randomly on television broadcasts, ticking down to the new millennium, branded with a cryptic code Y2J. The audience was intrigued, completely unaware that they were witnessing the final seconds of Chris Jericho's imprisonment. The glass ceiling of his past was about to be shattered by the sheer, undeniable volume of his arrival. On the evening of August 9th, 1999, the World Wrestling Federation broadcasted its flagship program, Raw, live from a sold-out arena in Chicago. In the center of the ring stood The Rock, the absolute pinnacle of the industry and the most protected asset in Vince McMahon's empire. Then, the massive screen above the stage flickered to life. The mysterious Y2J countdown clock finally hit 0. A deafening explosion of pyrotechnics shook the arena, and Chris Jericho stepped out. To fully grasp the psychological magnitude of this debut, you must contrast it with the reality Jericho had just escaped. Less than a month prior, WCW executives told him he was politically too insignificant to share a ring with Bill Goldberg and ordered him to be squashed in seconds. Now, in his very first night in the rival company, Vince McMahon handed him a live microphone and instructed him to go toe-to-toe with the most electrifying speaker in the business. This was not a corporate favor. It was a ruthless capitalistic test. McMahon was effectively saying, "You claim you are a main event talent suppressed by WCW's politics. Here is my biggest star. Prove it or drown." Jericho did not drown. He absorbed The Rock's trademark insults and fired back with equal ferocity. He proved unequivocally that he belonged at the adults' table. He had transitioned from a toxic oligarchy into a hyper-competitive meritocracy. In the WWF, cash was king. McMahon did not care about the fragile egos of aging veterans. He cared about who could captivate an audience. The WWF allowed Jericho the room to fail, adapt, and refine his psychology. By the year 2000, he had firmly cemented himself as a lucrative franchise player. Meanwhile, a spectacular, catastrophic tragedy was unfolding down south in Atlanta. World Championship Wrestling was dying. The collapse of WCW remains one of the most staggering corporate failures in modern entertainment history. The root cause of this collapse was the exact same institutional arrogance that had driven Jericho away. You cannot build a sustainable business model on the fragile egos of aging men. By allowing veterans with creative control clauses to monopolize the spotlight, WCW starved itself of a future. The audience grew exhausted. When fans looked for something new, dynamic, and hungry, they tuned into the WWF. As WCW's television ratings plummeted and the company hemorrhaged over $60 million a year, the corporate bureaucracy panicked. But the rot was terminal. In March 2001, the final fatal blow was struck. Vince McMahon purchased World Championship Wrestling. The billionaire bought his rival's entire tape library, their trademarks, and their remaining assets for a mere fraction of their prior value. The poetic justice was staggering. The empire that arrogantly told Chris Jericho he was too small to matter had bankrupted itself. The aging millionaires who had conspired to hold him down were suddenly forced to look for work in a monopolized industry now entirely controlled by Vince McMahon. The glass ceiling hadn't just cracked. The entire building had collapsed into dust. Following the buyout, the WWF absorbed the remnants of the WCW roster. For the first time in history, McMahon possessed both the WWF Championship and the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. To resolve this, management scheduled a 4-man, one-night tournament in December 2001 to crown the first ever undisputed champion. The bracket included Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Kurt Angle, and Chris Jericho. Take a moment to absorb the historical weight of that inclusion. Just 3 years prior, WCW management had told Jericho he was not worthy of a Sunday night main event. Now, he was selected to stand shoulder to shoulder with the 3 biggest box office draws of the modern era. On the night of December 9th, 2001, Chris Jericho wrestled The Rock. It was a psychological masterpiece, culminating with Jericho pinning the icon in the center of the ring to win the WCW Championship, the very title the executives in Atlanta swore he would never touch. But the night was not over. Immediately following that match, Jericho was forced to face Stone Cold Steve Austin, the undisputed face of the company. The two men battled back and forth until the closing moments when Chris Jericho covered Austin. The referee's hand hit the mat 3 times. The bell rang, and history was irrevocably rewritten. Chris Jericho had defeated The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin in the exact same night. He hoisted both massive gold championship belts into the air, unifying them to become the first undisputed champion in the history of professional wrestling. It was an achievement of such staggering magnitude that it forever insulated his legacy against any corporate skeptic. The story of the conspiracy victim is not merely a wrestling anecdote, it is a definitive historical autopsy of institutional arrogance. It is a profound lesson about the absolute folly of suppressing merit to protect fragile egos. The executives at WCW treated talent as a disposable commodity, assuming that if they placed a large enough boulder in the river, the water would simply stop flowing. But true talent is a force of nature. When you attempt to build a dam to hold back a prodigy, you do not destroy them. You merely build immense, unbearable pressure. Chris Jericho took every insult, every squandered television segment, and every arrogant dismissal, and he weaponized it. He used the cruelty of the WCW system as the creative fuel to bypass the boardroom entirely. He proved that any system that fears its own future is actively orchestrating its own demise. WCW chose to protect its past, and as a direct result, it ceased to exist. Chris Jericho chose to bet his livelihood on his own potential, walking away from guaranteed hush money, because he respected his dignity more than he feared corporate rejection. The man who was told he would only ever be an opening act went on to redefine the industry, outlasting every single executive who ever told him to know his place.